Texarkana sits on the border between Texas and Arkansas, a city literally divided by a state line that runs right down the middle of State Line Avenue. In 1946, it was a quiet place where everyone knew their neighbors, where doors were left unlocked, and where the biggest excitement was Friday night football games at the high school. But in the spring of that year, something changed. Something dark crept into Texarkana, transforming it from a peaceful border town into a place of terror that would grip not just the community, but the entire nation. It started on a cool February night when the full moon hung low and bright in the Texas sky. February 22nd, 1946. A date that would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would last for 3 months and leave 5 people dead, countless others traumatized, and a killer who vanished like smoke into the night. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry were young and in love, doing what couples did in small-town America. They'd driven to a secluded spot on Richmond Road, a lover's lane just outside the city limits, to spend some time alone. They parked near an abandoned farmhouse, the moonlight streaming through the windows of Jimmy's car. They never saw him coming. A figure appeared at the driver's side window, illuminated by a flashlight. But this wasn't a curious passerby or a concerned citizen. The man wore a white cloth sack over his head with crude eye holes cut out, and in his hand was a gun. "This is a hold-up," the masked man said, his voice flat and emotionless. But what happened next proved this was something far worse than a simple robbery. Because the Phantom Killer, as he would come to be known, wasn't interested in money. He was interested in violence. Before we continue down this dark path, I want to connect with you for just a moment. Where are you right now? Are you listening from Los Angeles, Sao Paulo, London, or maybe somewhere closer to Texarkana itself? Drop your location in the comments below. I love knowing where this community reaches across the world. All of us gathered here in the quiet hours to explore these stories together. If you're new to this channel, welcome. You found a place where we tell true crime stories with depth, respect, and unwavering commitment to the truth. We don't sensationalize or exploit. We honor the victims by telling their stories completely and honestly. If that resonates with you, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you're already part of this family, thank you from the bottom of my heart. A like on this video and sharing it with someone who appreciates well-researched true crime helps us continue this work. Your support means everything. Now, let's return to that moonlit night in February 1946, to Jimmy and Mary Jean, and to the masked man who would terrorize an entire region. The attack was brutal and seemingly motiveless. The Phantom ordered them out of the car at gunpoint. He beat Jimmy savagely with the pistol, fracturing his skull. He sexually assaulted Mary Jean, then beat her as well. But here's what was strange: he didn't kill them. He could have. He had every opportunity. Instead, he left them there, broken and bleeding, and disappeared into the darkness. When police arrived, they treated it as an isolated incident. A robbery gone wrong, maybe. A drifter passing through town. These things happened, unfortunately, even in quiet places like Texarkana. But this wasn't an isolated incident. This was just the beginning. March 24th, 1946. The moon was full again, hanging in the sky like a watching eye. Texas State Police Officer A.V. Tackle Collins was making his rounds through the city when he noticed something unusual near the Spring Lake Park area. A car was parked in a strange position, its doors open, engine still running. Collins approached cautiously, his hand on his service revolver. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside the car was Richard Griffin, 29 years old, slumped in the back seat. He had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. In the front seat was Polly Ann Moore, just 17 years old. She too had been shot in the back of the head twice. Both victims were positioned in ways that suggested they had been moved after death, arranged almost deliberately. The crime scene was meticulous. No fingerprints, no shell casings, no witnesses, just two young people who had gone out for an evening together and would never come home. The community was shocked, but many still believed this was a separate incident. Maybe a lover's quarrel, maybe a jealous ex-boyfriend, maybe anything except what it actually was: the work of the same masked man who had attacked Jimmy and Mary Jean a month earlier. Police Chief Jack Runnels and Bowie County Sheriff W.H. Presley formed a joint task force. They interviewed everyone who knew Richard and Polly. They searched for enemies, for motives, for anything that might explain why two innocent people had been murdered on a quiet Sunday night. They found nothing. Because the Phantom didn't need a motive beyond the one that lived in his twisted mind. He was hunting, and the full moon was his signal to kill. And he wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. After the Griffinmore murders, Texarkana transformed overnight. The sense of safety that had defined the community evaporated like morning dew. Hardware stores sold out of locks and chains. Gun shops couldn't keep weapons in stock. People who had never owned firearms before were buying pistols and shotguns, determined to protect their families. The local newspaper, the Texarkana Gazette, tried to walk a fine line between informing the public and creating panic. But panic was already spreading. Two brutal murders, both occurring under a full moon, both targeting young couples in parked cars. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Police received hundreds of tips. Every suspicious person was reported. Every stranger in town was questioned. Roadblocks were set up on highways leading in and out of Texarkana. Officers worked around the clock, following leads that went nowhere, chasing shadows that dissolved under scrutiny. The FBI was called in. Special agents arrived from Dallas and Little Rock, bringing with them expertise in serial crimes. But even they were baffled. The killer left no physical evidence. No witnesses could provide a description beyond the white hood Jimmy Hollis had seen. It was as if the Phantom was a ghost, materializing only to kill and then vanishing back into the night. Captain Manuel Lone Wolf Gonzalez of the Texas Rangers took charge of the investigation. Gonzalez was a legend in law enforcement, a man who had tracked down countless criminals across the Southwest. If anyone could catch the Phantom, it was him. But as March turned to April, and as the moon waxed full once again, everyone in Texarkana held their breath. Would the killer strike again? Or had he satisfied whatever dark urge drove him and moved on? The answer came on April 14, 1946, and this time the horror would be even worse. Paul Martin was 16 years old, a popular student at Texas High School. Betty Jo Booker was 15, the youngest daughter of a prominent local family. They had gone on a double date to the movie theater on that Saturday night, then dropped off their friends and decided to drive around for a while before heading home. They never made it home. On Sunday morning, April 14th, a motorist spotted Paul Martin's body lying in a ditch on a rural road north of town. He had been shot 4 times, once in the face, once in the neck, and twice in the chest. His body showed signs of having been dragged, and his clothes were disheveled. He had clearly fought his attacker, fought hard, but it hadn't been enough. Betty Jo Booker was missing. The entire community mobilized to search for her. Hundreds of volunteers combed the countryside, calling her name, praying they would find her alive. Police organized search parties that covered every inch of ground within a 10-mile radius of where Paul's body was found. For 6 agonizing hours, her family held on to hope. Maybe she had escaped. Maybe she was hiding somewhere, traumatized but alive. Maybe the killer had let her go. At 1:30 p.m., those hopes were shattered. Betty Jo's body was found 2 miles from where Paul had been killed. She had been shot twice in the face with a .22 caliber weapon. Her saxophone, which she had been carrying from a school band performance, lay nearby, as if the killer had tossed it aside carelessly. The brutality of these murders was different from the previous attacks. The killer seemed to be escalating, becoming bolder, more violent. He had killed them both, hunted them down like animals, and left them for their families to find. Texarkana erupted into full-blown terror. This wasn't just about young couples parking in lovers' lanes anymore. The Phantom had struck on a public road, had murdered teenagers who were simply driving home. No one was safe. The days following the Martin Booker murders transformed Texarkana into something resembling a war zone. The streets were empty after dark. Businesses that normally stayed open late closed their doors at sundown. The few people who did venture out at night traveled in groups, armed and vigilant. The police presence was overwhelming. Officers patrolled in pairs, their cars equipped with shotguns and rifles. Roadblocks were set up at every major intersection. Anyone out after dark was stopped and questioned. The constitutional rights of privacy and freedom of movement took a back seat to the desperate need to catch a killer. High school proms were canceled. Sporting events were moved to daylight hours. The traditional Friday night cruising that teenagers had enjoyed for generations came to an abrupt halt. Parents kept their children home, and those children who did go out were given strict curfews and instructions to stay in public, well-lit areas. The media descended on Texarkana like locusts. Reporters from Dallas, Houston, Little Rock, and even New York City flooded the small border town, all chasing the same story. Who was the Phantom Killer, and when would he strike again? The pressure on law enforcement was immense. Captain Gonzalez held daily press conferences, trying to project confidence while privately admitting to his team that they had almost nothing to go on. The .22 caliber weapon used in the Martin Booker murders was common. The lack of physical evidence was unprecedented. And the randomness of the victims, different ages, different social circles, different parts of town, made it impossible to predict where the Phantom might strike next. Psychologists were brought in to create a profile. They theorized that the killer was likely a local man, someone familiar with the area's back roads and lovers' lanes. He was probably in his 20s or 30s, physically strong enough to overpower multiple victims. He was organized, methodical, and completely lacking in empathy or remorse. But theories weren't enough. The people of Texarkana wanted action. They wanted the Phantom caught, tried, and executed. And they wanted it to happen before the next full moon. May 3rd, 1946. The moon was approaching full once again, and Texarkana braced itself for another attack. Police presence was at an all-time high. Patrol cars sat at every known lover's lane. Undercover officers posed as couples, hoping to lure the Phantom into a trap. But the Phantom didn't strike at a lover's lane this time. He changed his pattern in a way that proved he was far smarter than anyone had given him credit for. Virgil Starks was a 37-year-old farmer who lived with his wife Katie on an isolated farmhouse about 10 miles northeast of Texarkana. They were a quiet, hard-working couple who kept to themselves and bothered no one. That Friday evening, they were doing what they did every evening. Virgil was reading the newspaper in his favorite chair by the window, and Katie was in the bedroom getting ready for bed. At approximately 10:30 p.m., a shot rang out. The bullet crashed through the window and struck Virgil in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Katie, hearing the shot and her husband's body hitting the floor, ran into the living room. As she bent over Virgil's body, trying to comprehend what had happened, another shot came through the window. The bullet grazed her face, breaking her jaw. A third shot hit her in the back. Katie, despite her injuries, had the presence of mind to realize that whoever was shooting was still out there. She crawled across the floor, broken glass cutting her hands and knees, and made it to the bedroom where the telephone was. With blood streaming down her face, her jaw shattered and making speech nearly impossible, Katie Starks managed to call for help. Then, knowing the killer might come into the house, she grabbed Virgil's shotgun and positioned herself by the door, ready to defend herself if he came through. But he didn't come through. By the time police arrived, the shooter had vanished. Virgil Starks was dead, and Katie was rushed to the hospital where doctors worked frantically to save her life. She would survive, but she would carry the physical and emotional scars of that night forever. The attack on the Starks farm changed everything. The Phantom had broken his pattern completely. This wasn't a young couple at a lover's lane. This was a married couple in their own home. If he could strike there, he could strike anywhere. Texarkana descended into complete paranoia. The murder of Virgil Starks and the attempted murder of Katie provided investigators with something they desperately needed: physical evidence. Bullets recovered from the scene were .22 caliber, consistent with the weapons used in the Martin Booker murders. Footprints were found outside the window where the shooter had stood. And most importantly, Katie Starks was alive and could potentially identify her attacker if he was ever caught. Captain Gonzalez and his team worked the crime scene meticulously. They photographed every inch of the property. They made casts of the footprints, size 10 or 11, suggesting a man of average height and build. They analyzed the trajectory of the bullets to determine where the shooter had been standing. What emerged was a chilling picture of premeditation. The killer had approached the isolated farmhouse on foot, moving through the darkness with clear purpose. He had positioned himself outside the window where he had a clear line of sight to Virgil Starks. He had fired multiple shots with calm precision. And when Katie had escaped to call for help, he had fled rather than risk being caught. This wasn't the work of a frenzied madman. This was calculated, controlled, methodical. The Phantom was far more dangerous than a simple serial killer. He was an intelligent predator who planned his attacks carefully and adapted his methods to avoid capture. The investigation expanded to include every male in the Texarkana area who fit the basic profile. Police conducted interviews with hundreds of men, checking alibis for each of the attack dates. Anyone with a history of violence, anyone who had recently moved to the area, anyone who seemed suspicious in any way was questioned extensively. The Arkansas State Police joined the Texas Rangers and the FBI in the manhunt. Officers worked 20-hour days, following up on every possible lead. Tips poured in from across the country. People claiming to have seen the Phantom, people accusing their neighbors, people confessing to the crimes who clearly had nothing to do with them. One promising lead involved a young man who had been seen near the Starks farm on the night of the attack. When police tracked him down, he had scratches on his arms and couldn't account for his whereabouts during the shooting. He was arrested and held for questioning. For 48 hours, the people of Texarkana dared to hope that the nightmare was over. But the suspect had an alibi that checked out, and the physical evidence didn't match. He was released, and the investigation continued. As the weeks passed without another attack, various theories emerged about the Phantom's identity. The most prominent suspect was a man named Yowell Swinney, a 29-year-old car thief with a violent criminal history. Swinney had been arrested in July 1946 on unrelated car theft charges. During his interrogation, his wife at the time made statements that seemed to implicate him in the Phantom murders. She claimed he had come home on the nights of the attacks with blood on his clothes. She said he had bragged about making headlines and frightening the whole city. Captain Gonzalez was convinced he had found his man. Swinney fit the profile perfectly. He was the right age, the right build, and he had a history of violence and criminal behavior. He knew the Texarkana area intimately, having grown up there. And his wife's statements, while not enough to convict him in court, provided circumstantial evidence that seemed compelling. But there was a problem. Swinney's wife later recanted her statements, claiming she had been coerced by police and prosecutors who threatened her with prosecution as an accessory if she didn't cooperate. Without her testimony, the case against Swinney fell apart. There was no physical evidence linking him to the murders. No murder weapon was ever found. No witnesses could place him at any of the crime scenes. While many investigators remained convinced of his guilt, they didn't have enough evidence to charge him with the Phantom murders. Swinney was sent to prison for the car theft charges and served time before being released. He would spend the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion, with many people in Texarkana convinced he was the Phantom killer who had gotten away with murder. Other suspects emerged over the years. A drifter who had been in the area during the spring of 1946 and had a history of sexual violence. A mentally disturbed local man who had made cryptic statements about the killings. Even a prominent businessman whose strange behavior after the murders raised suspicions among those who knew him. But none of these leads panned out. None of the suspects could be definitively linked to the crimes. And as time passed, the trail grew colder. After the attack on the Starks farm, something strange happened. The killings stopped. The full moon came and went in June, July, August, no attacks. The heightened police presence continued. Patrol cars still monitored lovers' lanes. Citizens remained armed and vigilant. But the Phantom had disappeared as mysteriously as he had appeared. There were several theories about why the murders stopped. Some believed the killer had died, perhaps in an accident, perhaps by suicide. The intense pressure of the investigation, the massive law enforcement presence, The constant fear of being caught might have driven him to take his own life. Others theorized that he had been arrested for an unrelated crime and was sitting in prison somewhere, unable to continue his killing spree. This would explain why the murders stopped so abruptly and never resumed. A darker theory suggested that the Phantom had simply moved on to another location, that somewhere else in America, young couples were being murdered by the same methodical killer, but the crimes weren't being connected because of poor communication between law enforcement agencies in different states. Captain Gonzalez privately believed that Yoel Swinney was the Phantom and that his arrest on car theft charges in July had interrupted the killing spree. But without proof, it remained just a theory. The people of Texarkana slowly, cautiously began to return to normal life. Businesses stayed open later. Teenagers started going out again, though always in groups and never to isolated locations. The constant fear that had gripped the community began to ease, though it never fully went away. Parents who had lived through the Phantom murders would tell their children about those terrifying months in 1946. Those children would tell their own children. The stories became local legend, passed down through generations, a reminder that evil can appear anywhere, even in the quietest, most peaceful communities. But the question remained, who was the Phantom Killer, and why did he stop? Katie Stark's survival was nothing short of miraculous. The bullets that struck her had caused devastating injuries. Her jaw was shattered, she had lost several teeth, and the wound to her back had narrowly missed her spine. But she was alive, and she was the only victim who had survived a direct attack by the Phantom. Investigators hoped that Katie might be able to identify her attacker. She was interviewed extensively once she had recovered enough to speak. But her answers were frustratingly vague. The attack had happened so quickly, in such dim lighting, that she had never gotten a clear look at the shooter. She remembered the sound of breaking glass, the sight of Virgil falling from his chair. She remembered the searing pain as bullets struck her. She remembered crawling across the floor, desperate to reach the telephone. But of the person who had done this to her and her husband, she could provide almost no description. It was dark. It happened so fast. I didn't see his face. These were the phrases she repeated over and over in her interviews. The trauma of the attack had affected her memory, and no amount of questioning could extract details that simply weren't there. Katie lived the rest of her life in that farmhouse, the place where her husband had been murdered and where she had nearly died. Some people thought she was crazy to stay, but Katie was a strong, determined woman who refused to be driven from her home by fear. She kept Virgil's shotgun by her bed for the rest of her life. She installed new locks on all the doors and windows, and every night she would check and recheck those locks before allowing herself to sleep. Katie Starks passed away in 1994, nearly 50 years after that terrible night. She died never knowing who had killed her husband, never getting the closure that comes with seeing a killer brought to justice. But she had survived, and in surviving, she had denied the Phantom the complete victory he had sought. The Texarkana Moonlight Murders became part of American true crime folklore. The case inspired books, articles, and eventually a 1976 film called The Town That Dreaded Sundown, which dramatized the murders and introduced the Phantom Killer to a new generation. The film, while based on the actual events, took significant creative liberties. It portrayed the killer as an almost supernatural figure, stalking the streets of Texarkana with unstoppable determination. While the real investigation had been marked by frustration and dead ends, the film created a narrative of cat-and-mouse pursuit between law enforcement and the killer. The Town That Dreaded Sundown became a cult classic, and it had an unintended consequence. It kept the Texarkana murders in the public consciousness. Every few years, renewed interest in the case would spark new investigations, new theories, new attempts to finally identify the Phantom. In 2014, a meta-sequel to the original film was released, also titled The Town That Dreaded Sundown. This version played with the idea of the murders as legend, exploring how the original crimes had shaped the community's identity and how fear can be passed down through generations. But beyond the films and books, the Texarkana murders had a real, lasting impact on the community itself. The small border town that had once been defined by its friendliness and openness became known as the place where a phantom killer had terrorized couples under the full moon. Older residents who had lived through those terrifying months would lower their voices when discussing the murders, as if speaking too loudly about them might somehow summon the phantom back. Parents warned their teenage children about the dangers of parking on lonely roads. The collective trauma of 1946 became woven into the fabric of Texarkana's identity. And every spring, when the full moon rose over the city, some people would remember. They would lock their doors a little more securely. They would glance out their windows at the moonlit streets, and they would wonder, was the phantom still out there somewhere? Or had he taken his secrets to the grave? In recent decades, cold case investigators have taken fresh looks at the Texarkana Moonlight murders, hoping that modern forensic technology might finally solve the case that had stumped detectives in 1946. DNA analysis offered the most promising avenue. If the killer had left any biological evidence at the crime scenes, blood, hair, skin cells, modern techniques could potentially extract a DNA profile that could be compared against databases or living suspects. The problem was that very little physical evidence from the 1946 crime scenes had been preserved. This was long before DNA analysis existed, and evidence collection protocols were far less sophisticated. Most of the physical evidence that had been gathered was lost, destroyed, or degraded beyond the point of usability. Some bullets remained, carefully preserved in evidence lockers. Ballistics experts could confirm that the same .22 caliber weapon had been used in multiple attacks, but without the gun itself, this information was of limited use. In 2014, James Presley, the son of the original sheriff who had investigated the murders, published a book arguing that Yoel Swinney was definitely the phantom killer. Presley had access to his father's personal files on the case, including notes and evidence that had never been made public. The book presented a circumstantial but compelling case against Swinney. It detailed his criminal history, his presence in Texarkana during the murders, his wife's accusations, and various pieces of evidence that pointed to his guilt. But it also acknowledged that without a confession or physical evidence, Swinney could never have been convicted in a court of law. Other researchers disagreed, pointing to alternative suspects and questioning whether the crimes were actually the work of one person or possibly multiple killers. Some suggested that the Starks farm attack was actually a copycat crime, unrelated to the earlier Lover's Lane murders. The debate continues to this day among true crime enthusiasts, amateur detectives, and professional investigators. Online forums dedicated to the case analyze every scrap of evidence, propose new theories, and argue passionately about the phantom's identity. But for all the modern technology and renewed interest, the Texarkana Moonlight murders remain officially unsolved. In all the speculation about the phantom's identity, it's important to remember the real victims of these crimes, the people whose lives were taken or forever altered by a killer's violence. Richard Griffin was a Navy veteran who had survived World War II only to be murdered in his hometown at age 29. Polly Ann Moore was just 17, with her whole life ahead of her. They had been on a simple date, enjoying each other's company, when their lives were brutally ended. Paul Martin was a popular teenager, an athlete and student who was well-liked by everyone who knew him. Betty Jo Booker was a talented young musician, carrying her saxophone home from a performance when she was hunted down and killed. Both were only 16 and 15 years old, respectively, children, really, whose futures were stolen in the most horrible way imaginable. Virgil Starks was a hard-working farmer, a man who had built a life with his wife on land they loved. He was murdered in his own home, in his favorite chair, while reading the newspaper on a quiet Friday evening. Katie Stark survived, but she lived the rest of her life with the trauma of that night. She had watched her husband die. She had felt bullets tear through her own body. She had crawled across broken glass to summon help, never knowing if the killer would come through the door to finish what he had started. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry survived the first attack, but they carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The violation they experienced, the terror of facing a masked man with a gun, the brutal beating, these were wounds that never fully healed. These weren't just statistics or case files. They were human beings with families who loved them, with dreams and plans and hopes for the future. They were part of a community that mourned their loss and was forever changed by their deaths. Texarkana holds memorials for the victims on significant anniversaries. Their names are spoken with respect and sorrow. They are remembered not as the Phantom's victims, but as individuals who deserved long, happy lives and who were robbed of that future by senseless violence. So who was the Phantom Killer? After nearly 80 years, can we finally answer that question? The truth is, we probably never will know with complete certainty. Yowell Swinney died in 1994, taking whatever secrets he had to his grave. If he was the Phantom, and many investigators believe he was, then the case died with him. The circumstantial evidence against Swinney is substantial. He was the right age, the right build, and in the right place at the right times. He had a history of violence and showed no remorse for his crimes. His wife's testimony, though later recanted, contained details that seemed too specific to be fabricated. And most tellingly, the murders stopped after his arrest on unrelated charges. But circumstantial evidence isn't proof. Without a confession, without physical evidence, without witnesses who could place him at the crime scenes, Swinney could never have been convicted. And in America, we believe in the presumption of innocence until guilt is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Other suspects have been proposed over the years. Some researchers believe the killer was a drifter who passed through Texarkana in the spring of 1946, killed for reasons known only to himself, and then moved on to other hunting grounds. This would explain why the murders had no apparent motive and why they stopped so suddenly. The killer simply left town. Another theory suggests the Phantom was someone who died shortly after the last attack, which would explain why the killings ceased. Perhaps he was killed in a car accident. Perhaps he committed suicide, unable to live with the guilt of what he had done. Without a body or a name, we'll never know. The darkest possibility is that the Phantom was never caught because he was someone no one suspected, a respected member of the community, perhaps even someone involved in the investigation itself. It's been suggested that the killer might have been a law enforcement officer, which would explain his ability to avoid detection and his knowledge of police procedures. But this theory, while intriguing, is purely speculative. There's no evidence to support it beyond the unsettling fact that the killer was never caught. The Texarkana Moonlight murders teach us several uncomfortable truths about crime, investigation, and justice. First, they demonstrate how a single determined killer can terrorize an entire community and evade capture despite massive law enforcement efforts. The Phantom operated in an era before DNA analysis, before criminal databases, before the sophisticated forensic tools we have today. But even with modern technology, there's no guarantee he would have been caught. Second, the case shows how quickly a sense of safety can evaporate. Texarkana was a peaceful town where violent crime was rare. In a matter of weeks, it became a place where residents were afraid to leave their homes after dark. That transformation from safety to fear happened almost overnight. Third, the murders remind us that some cases simply don't get solved. We live in an age of crime television shows where every mystery is neatly resolved in 60 minutes. But reality is messier. Sometimes the bad guy gets away. Sometimes families never get closure. Sometimes justice is denied. The investigation into the Phantom murders was thorough and professional. Captain Gonzalez and his team worked tirelessly, following every lead, interviewing hundreds of suspects, using every investigative tool available to them. They did everything right, and they still didn't catch the killer. That's not a reflection of their incompetence. It's a reflection of the limitations of criminal investigation, especially in an era before modern forensics. The Phantom was careful, methodical, and lucky, and that combination allowed him to commit 5 murders and multiple assaults without being caught. Finally, the case shows us the lasting impact that violent crime has on communities. Nearly 80 years later, Texarkana still carries the weight of those terrifying months in 1946. The murders shaped the city's identity, influenced how parents raised their children, and created a collective trauma that has been passed down through generations. That's the real legacy of the Phantom Killer. Not just the lives he took, but the fear he left behind. Today, Texarkana is a thriving city of about 75,000 people. It's grown far beyond the small border town it was in 1946. New businesses have moved in. New generations have been born who know the Phantom murders only as local legend, stories their grandparents tell about the old days. But the history remains. The sites where the murders occurred are still there, though most have changed beyond recognition. The farmhouse where Virgil Starks was killed and Katie was wounded has been renovated and occupied by different families over the years. The lovers' lanes where Richard and Paul and Betty Jo met their ends have been developed or abandoned. Spring Lake Park, where Richard Griffin and Polly and more were found, is now a popular recreational area. Families picnic there, children play on the playground equipment, joggers run along the paths. Few of them know that this peaceful park was once a crime scene, the place where two young people died violently on a spring night in 1946. The Texarkana museums maintain exhibits about the Phantom murders. Newspaper clippings, police reports, photographs from the investigation, all carefully preserved for future generations. Tour guides tell the story to visitors who come seeking a connection to this dark chapter of American true crime history. And every spring, when the full moon rises over Texarkana, some of the older residents still remember. They remember the fear, the uncertainty, the terrible realization that a killer was hunting among them. They remember locking their doors, checking their windows, sleeping with guns within reach. They remember the victims, young people whose lives were cut short, families torn apart by senseless violence. They remember the manhunt, the roadblocks, the constant presence of armed police officers on every street corner. And they remember that the Phantom was never caught, that somewhere, the person who committed those horrible crimes either died with their secret or lived the rest of their life free, unpunished, knowing they had gotten away with murder. Even after decades of investigation and speculation, fundamental questions about the Texarkana Moonlight murders remain unanswered. Why did the Phantom choose Texarkana? Was he a local resident who knew the area intimately, or was he an outsider who selected the border town for specific reasons? The location's unique position straddling two states might have been strategic, creating jurisdictional complications for law enforcement. Why did he target couples? Sexual violence was a component of the attacks, but it didn't seem to be the primary motive. The Phantom appeared to derive satisfaction from the act of hunting and killing itself, the couple serving as convenient victims rather than specific targets chosen for personal reasons. Why did he use the full moon? This pattern was so consistent that investigators used it to predict when the next attack might occur. But what significance did the moon hold for the killer? Was it practical, providing light to see by while still maintaining cover of darkness? Or was it psychological, some twisted symbolism that made sense only to him? Why did the attack stop? This might be the most important question of all. Serial killers rarely stop killing of their own volition. Something happened to end the Phantom's murder spree. But what? Death, imprisonment, relocation, or some other factor we haven't considered? If Yowell Swinney was the Phantom, why did he never confess? Even on his deathbed, with nothing to lose, Swinney maintained his innocence regarding the murders. Was he truly innocent, wrongly accused by a desperate investigation? Or was he a psychopath capable of taking his terrible secrets to the grave? These questions haunt the case, creating an incomplete narrative that frustrates anyone who seeks definitive answers. The Texarkana Moonlight murders are like a puzzle with crucial pieces missing. We can see the outline of what happened, but the complete picture remains forever out of reach. The impact of the Phantom murders extended far beyond Texarkana. The case influenced law enforcement practices across the country, demonstrating the need for better interagency cooperation and more sophisticated investigative techniques. The involvement of multiple jurisdictions, Texas State Police, Arkansas State Police, local sheriffs, and the FBI, was unprecedented at the time. While coordination between these agencies was often difficult, the Phantom murders helped establish protocols for future multi-jurisdictional investigations. The case also highlighted the limitations of forensic science in the 1940s and created demand for better evidence collection and analysis methods. While these improvements came too late to help catch the Phantom, they benefited countless future investigations. On a more personal level, the murders affected how parents throughout America thought about their children's safety. The idea that teenagers could be hunted and killed simply for parking on a quiet road resonated with families across the nation. The case contributed to a broader cultural anxiety about youth, sexuality, and vulnerability that would shape American society for decades. The media coverage of the Phantom murders also established templates for how serial killer cases would be reported in the future. The dramatic nickname, the focus on the victims, the breathless updates about the investigation, all these elements would become standard in true crime journalism. For the families of the victims, the ripple effects were more immediate and devastating. Parents lost children. Siblings lost brothers and sisters. The Starks family lost a husband and father. These losses created voids that could never be filled, grief that could never fully heal. And for everyone who lived through those terrifying months in Texarkana, the experience left permanent psychological scars. The loss of innocence, the shattering of their sense of safety, the knowledge that evil could strike without warning. These were wounds that time couldn't completely heal. As we reach the end of the story, it's important to acknowledge what we don't know. We don't know who the Phantom Killer was. We don't know why he killed. We don't know why he stopped. These mysteries remain unsolved nearly 80 years after the last murder. But we do know the cost. 5 lives taken. Richard Griffin, Polly and Moore, Paul Martin, Betty Jo Booker, and Virgil Starks. 2 lives forever changed. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry, the survivors of the first attack. And 1 life saved but scarred. Katie Starks, who lived 50 more years carrying the weight of that terrible night. We know that an entire community was traumatized, that generations of Texarkana residents grew up with the shadow of the Phantom hanging over them. We know that families were torn apart by grief, that sense of safety was shattered, that trust was replaced by fear. The Phantom Killer represents something that frightens us on a primal level, the random, inexplicable violence that can intrude into ordinary life without warning. He chose his victims not because they had wronged him, but because they were available. They were young people enjoying life, couples in love, a man reading his newspaper at home. They could have been anyone. They could have been us. And that, ultimately, is why this case continues to fascinate and horrify more than 7 decades later. It reminds us that evil exists, that it sometimes goes unpunished, and that the questions we most desperately want answered sometimes remain forever beyond our reach. As you drift off to sleep tonight, listening to the rain, think about those spring nights in 1946. Think about the full moon rising over Texarkana, casting its pale light on empty streets and locked doors. Think about young people whose only crime was being young and in love. Think about Richard and Polly, Paul and Betty Jo, driving down dark roads with no idea that death was waiting by where the murders occurred are still there, though time and development have changed them. The memories fade as those who lived through those terrible months pass away, leaving only stories, only legends, only the documented facts of an unsolved mystery. But the victims deserve to be remembered, not as the Phantom's victims, but as people who lived and loved and dreamed. Richard Griffin, Polly and Moore, Paul Martin, Betty Jo Booker, Virgil Starks, say their names. Remember that they mattered. Remember that their lives had value beyond the tragedy of how they ended. The Phantom Killer may have escaped justice in this world, but his victims, they are not forgotten. And in the remembering, in the telling of their stories, perhaps we deny the Phantom his final victory. He wanted to be remembered as a phantom, a shadow, a figure of terror. Instead, let him fade into obscurity while his victims are remembered with dignity, compassion, and respect. The moon rises, the rain falls, and somewhere in the quiet darkness, the truth waits to be discovered. The gravel crunched beneath their tires as the young couple pulled into the secluded clearing. It was a warm summer night in 1968, just outside Florence, and Barbara Lacci and her lover Antonio Lo Bianco had found their usual spot. A quiet stretch of countryside where the cypress trees stood like sentinels against the Tuscan sky. They had no idea they were being watched. Inside the car, whispered conversations turned to laughter, then silence. The windows fogged. The crickets sang their evening chorus. Everything seemed perfect, ordinary even. But somewhere in the darkness beyond their headlights, someone was moving closer. What happened next would haunt Italy for nearly 3 decades. At 10:30 p.m., a farmer living nearby heard what he thought were firecrackers. Pop, pop, pop. He went back to his dinner, thinking nothing of it. By morning, 2 bodies would be discovered in that car, riddled with bullets from a .22 Beretta. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the violence itself. It was what the killer had done after. Barbara's 6-year-old son, Natalino, had been asleep in the back seat. When police found him wandering along the road in the early morning hours, his clothes were soaked with his mother's blood. "My mama's dead," he told them, his voice hollow. The child had witnessed something no one should ever see, but what he couldn't tell them was far more terrifying. The killer had let him live. Why? Before we go deeper into this nightmare, I have a question for you. Where are you listening from right now? Are you tucked into bed in New York, Melbourne, or maybe somewhere in Europe? Drop your location in the comments. I love knowing where this story is reaching across the globe. And if you're new here, welcome to the channel. This is where we explore the darkest corners of true crime, told the way they deserve to be told, with respect for the victims and an unflinching look at the truth. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And if you're already part of this community, thank you. Your support means everything. So please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a well-told mystery. Now let's get back to Florence, because that night in 1968 was just the beginning. The investigation into Barbara and Antonio's murders went nowhere fast. Police initially suspected Barbara's husband, Stefano Malvetti, a classic crime of passion. He was arrested, tried, and eventually acquitted. For 6 years, the case went cold, buried in filing cabinets and fading memories. But the killer wasn't finished. He was just waiting. September 14th, 1974. 6 years had passed since that first attack, and Florence had nearly forgotten about the lovers found dead in their car. Then it happened again. Pasquale Gentlecore and Stefania Pettini, both 19 years old, had driven to a secluded spot in the countryside for an evening alone. They parked near an abandoned cemetery, a place where young couples often went seeking privacy. By morning, their bodies told a story of unimaginable horror. The same .22 Beretta had been used, the same methodical execution, but this time the killer had done something new, something that made even hardened investigators turn pale. Stefania's body had been violated after death, stabbed repeatedly in a ritualistic pattern. The killer was escalating, and he was sending a message. Detective Adolfo Izzo stood over the crime scene, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. He'd seen murders before. Florence wasn't immune to violence, but this was different. This felt personal, deliberate, almost ceremonial. "We're dealing with someone who enjoys this," he muttered to his partner. "And he's going to do it again." How right he was. But even Izzo couldn't have predicted what was coming. The third attack came in 1981, 7 years later. By now, the Florentine countryside had become a hunting ground, and young couples were the prey. Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Danuccio made the fatal mistake of parking their Fiat on a quiet country road one June evening. The killer approached with the same precision he'd shown before, swift, silent, deadly. The .22 Beretta barked 4 times. But what he did afterward would become his signature, the detail that would earn him his name, Il Mostro di Firenze, the monster of Florence. He mutilated Carmela's body with a surgical precision that suggested knowledge, experience, perhaps even pleasure. He removed parts of her, taking them with him into the night like trophies. This wasn't random violence anymore. This was ritual. The Italian media erupted. Headlines screamed warnings to young lovers. Stay away from the countryside. The monster strikes again. But the most chilling realization was slowly dawning on investigators. When they test-fired the .22 Beretta bullets from all 3 crime scenes, the ballistics matched perfectly. The same gun, the same killer, across 13 years. How many more would die before they caught him? The answer would shock an entire nation. By 1982, Florence was gripped by paranoia. The countryside that had once been a romantic escape had become a place of dread. Yet couples continued to seek privacy in those dark lanes and hidden clearings, perhaps believing that lightning couldn't strike twice in the same place. They were wrong. On June 19, 1982, Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini became the monster's fourth confirmed victims. Same location pattern, same weapon, same mutilation. The killer was following a script, but whose? His own twisted imagination or something darker? Chief Inspector Silvia Della Monica assembled a task force of 20 detectives. They worked 18-hour days, chasing leads that evaporated like morning fog. They interviewed hundreds of suspects. They staked out lovers' lanes for months. And yet, the monster seemed to know their every move, always one step ahead, always watching. "It's like he knows we're coming," one detective complained during a late-night briefing. "Like he's listening to our radios." Could the monster be someone close to the investigation? The thought was too terrible to consider, yet it refused to go away. Then came September 9, 1983, and everything changed. Horst Meyer and Uwe Rusch weren't supposed to die that night. They were German tourists, two young men traveling through Tuscany in a Volkswagen van. They'd parked in a secluded area to sleep, completely unaware of Florence's dark secret. The monster approached their van in the darkness, expecting to find another young couple. What he found instead would reveal something crucial about his psychology. He opened fire anyway. Horst died instantly. Uwe, wounded, managed to stumble from the van and collapse in the grass, where he bled out beneath the stars. When police arrived at dawn, they found a scene that made no sense. Why would the monster kill two men? There had been no mutilation, no ritualistic elements. The murders seemed almost hurried, disappointed. Criminal psychologist Francesco Bruno studied the scene photographs for hours. He made a mistake, Bruno concluded. He thought they were a couple. When he realized they weren't, he panicked. This tells us something important. He needs the woman. The ritual requires her. But why? What was driving this monster to hunt, to kill, to mutilate? The answer would come from the most unlikely source. A letter. Chapter 7. The Monster Speaks. In 1984, Florence newspapers received a package that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Inside was a small piece of flesh, removed from one of the previous victims, and a letter. The monster was communicating. The letter was crude, filled with misspellings and grammatical errors, suggesting someone with limited education. But the message was clear. The monster was proud of his work. He was mocking the police, and he wasn't finished. "You will never catch me," the letter read. "I am everywhere and nowhere. I am the shadow in your countryside, the fear in your hearts." Forensic document analyst Maria Esposito examined the letter under magnification. The handwriting showed signs of stress, pressure points where the pen had nearly torn through the paper. "Whoever wrote this was angry," she noted. "Not just at the police, but at something deeper. This is rage that's been building for years, maybe decades." The task force now faced a terrible question. Were they dealing with one killer, or could there be more? Some investigators believed the killings showed too much consistency to be the work of multiple people. Others pointed to the long gaps between murders, sometimes years, and wondered if the monster was actually several people working together. What they didn't know was that the monster was about to accelerate his timeline, and the next victims would change everything. Pia Rontini and Claudio Stefanaxi were deeply in love. At just 18 and 21, they had their whole lives ahead of them. On the evening of June 29, 1984, they drove Claudio's father's Fiat to a quiet spot in the countryside near Vicchio. They wanted privacy, a few hours away from parents and responsibilities. The monster was waiting. This time, he struck with unprecedented brutality. Both victims were shot multiple times, and Pia's body was subjected to the most extensive mutilation yet. The killer seemed to be refining his technique, taking his time, savoring the act. Police arrived to find a scene so disturbing that several officers requested transfers off the case. But there was something new. Witnesses in the area reported seeing a dark car leaving the scene shortly after the estimated time of death. A Fiat Ritmo, they said, though they couldn't make out the license plate in the darkness. For the first time, police had something concrete. They began searching for every dark Fiat Ritmo in the Florence area. There were thousands. The task seemed impossible, but they had to try, because if they didn't catch the monster soon, he would kill again. And he would do it in less than 2 months. August 1985. Jean-Michel Crevecoeur and Nadine Mauriat were honeymooning in Tuscany, young and in love, soaking in the beauty of the Italian countryside. They pitched their tent in what seemed like a peaceful spot near San Casciano, not knowing they had just entered the monster's territory. On the morning of September 8th, a farmer discovered their bodies. The monster had attacked with his usual precision, the .22 Beretta, the methodical execution. But this time, he'd added a new element to his ritual. He'd left Nadine's body posed in a specific way, almost theatrical, as if he were an artist displaying his work. And he'd taken something. A piece of her, cut with what forensic examiners determined was a sharp blade, possibly a scalpel. The precision of the cut suggested medical knowledge, or at least someone who'd done this many times before. The murder of the French tourists created an international incident. The French government demanded answers. The Italian press turned on the police, accusing them of incompetence. Chief Inspector Della Monica faced calls for his resignation. The pressure was unbearable. In desperation, police arrested Pietro Pacciani, a local farmer with a violent past. He'd killed a traveling salesman years earlier in a jealous rage. He was strange, solitary, known to spy on couples in the countryside. He seemed perfect for the role of monster. But was he, or were the police so desperate for an arrest that they'd convinced themselves of his guilt? The trial of Pietro Pacciani began in 1994, nearly a decade after the last known killing. The courtroom in Florence was packed with journalists, victims' families, and curious onlookers. This was it, the moment Italy had been waiting for. The monster would finally face justice. The prosecution's case seemed strong at first. Pacciani lived near several of the crime scenes. He owned weapons. He had a history of violence. Witnesses testified that he was obsessed with young couples, that he would watch them from the shadows. But then the defense began to poke holes in the case. Where was the .22 Beretta? Never found. Where was the physical evidence linking Pacciani to the crimes? Circumstantial at best. And most damning of all, Pacciani seemed too simple, too unsophisticated to have executed such methodical crimes. Criminal psychologist Bruno took the stand and delivered testimony that sent murmurs through the courtroom. The monster of Florence displays a level of planning and self-control that suggests intelligence, education, and social awareness. Pietro Pacciani, with all due respect, does not fit this profile. Still, on November 1st, 1994, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Pacciani was sentenced to life in prison. The case was closed. Florence could finally breathe again. Except it wasn't over. Not even close. February 1996. In a stunning reversal, an appeals court overturned Pacciani's conviction due to insufficient evidence. He walked free, a broken man who'd spent 2 years in prison for crimes he may not have committed. But the prosecution wasn't finished. If Pacciani didn't act alone, they reasoned, perhaps he'd been part of a group. They arrested 2 of his former friends, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, accusing them of being accomplices in the murders. During interrogation, Lotti confessed. He described in graphic detail how he, Vanni, and Pacciani had committed the murders together, how they'd stalked couples, how they'd performed the mutilations. It seemed like the final piece of the puzzle. But something didn't add up. Lotti's confession contained errors, details that didn't match the crime scenes, timelines that didn't work. Some investigators believed he was simply telling the police what they wanted to hear, perhaps in exchange for a lighter sentence. Chief Inspector Ruggero Perugini, who'd taken over the investigation, sat in his office late one night, surrounded by case files and crime scene photos. He'd devoted years of his life to catching the monster, and he still wasn't sure they had the right people. "What if we've been looking at this all wrong?" he asked his deputy. "What if the monster was never one of these men?" The question hung in the air like smoke. If not them, then who? Chapter 12. The Conspiracy Theories. As the case dragged on through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, alternative theories began to emerge. Some investigators believed the murders were connected to a satanic cult, pointing to the ritualistic nature of the mutilations and the way body parts had been removed as if for ceremonial purposes. Author Thomas Harris visited Florence while researching for his novel Hannibal and drew inspiration from the monster case. The idea that a sophisticated, cultured killer could hide in plain sight fascinated him. Was the monster someone respectable, someone above suspicion? Journalist Mario Spizzi and American author Douglas Preston spent years investigating the case independently. Their book, The Monster of Florence, proposed that a group of wealthy, powerful men had orchestrated the killings as part of occult rituals. They suggested the truth had been covered up at the highest levels. For their trouble, both men became targets of the investigation themselves. Preston was nearly arrested. Spizzi was interrogated for hours. The case had become so twisted, so convoluted, that investigators were now chasing the investigators. Meanwhile, Pietro Pacciani died in 2000, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. Vanni and Lottie remained in prison, still claiming innocence despite Lottie's confession. And the families of the victims were left with more questions than answers. Who had really killed their loved ones? And why? Today, more than 40 years after the last killing, Italy still doesn't know the full truth about the monster of Florence. The official count stands at 16 victims across 8 separate attacks between 1968 and 1985, all killed with the same .22 Beretta, all young couples seeking privacy in the Tuscan countryside. But here's what keeps investigators up at night. The .22 Beretta used in all the killings was traced to a murder in 1968. The very first killing of Barbara Lacci and Antonio Lo Bianco. That gun had been in evidence for years after that initial crime, supposedly secure in a police property room. How did the monster get access to it? Did someone in law enforcement give it to him? Was there a conspiracy within the police force itself? These questions have never been answered. And then there are the gaps in the timeline. Why did the monster wait 6 years between his first and second attacks? Why did he stop completely after 1985? Did he die? Was he arrested for another crime? Or did he simply decide he'd had enough? Some investigators believe the monster is still alive, living somewhere in Italy, an old man now, carrying the weight of 16 murders. Others think he died long ago, his identity lost to time. The truth is, we may never know. The monster of Florence changed Italy forever. The case exposed weaknesses in the Italian judicial system, showed how investigations could be derailed by ego and politics, and demonstrated the dangers of rushing to judgment without solid evidence. For the victims' families, there has never been closure. They've watched as suspect after suspect was paraded before cameras, as theories were proposed and discarded, as the truth seemed to slip further and further away with each passing year. The case also changed how Italians viewed their countryside. Those romantic lanes and secluded clearings, once symbols of youthful freedom and romance, became places of fear. Even today, older Italians remember the warnings. Don't park in the countryside. Don't become the monster's next victim. The psychological impact extended beyond Italy's borders. The case inspired countless books, documentaries, and fictional works. It became a reference point for discussions about serial killers, about the nature of evil, about how someone could commit such horrors and then return to normal life, perhaps sleeping peacefully while the whole country searched for him. Criminologist Alessandro Maluzzi perhaps put it best. The monster of Florence is a mirror held up to Italian society. In trying to find him, we discovered uncomfortable truths about ourselves. So where does that leave us? Sitting here decades later, no closer to the truth than we were in 1968. The most terrifying aspect of the Monster of Florence case isn't the violence, as brutal as it was. It's the uncertainty. It's the knowledge that someone capable of such methodical evil could blend seamlessly into society. Could be anyone, a farmer, a professional, a family man. It's the realization that the person sitting next to you on the bus, the man selling you groceries, the neighbor who waves hello every morning, could be hiding unimaginable darkness inside. The monster of Florence was never conclusively identified. He may have died without ever facing justice for his crimes. Or he may still be out there, an elderly man now watching documentaries about himself, reading books about his crimes, smiling at how close they came but never quite caught him. 16 young people lost their lives in the Tuscan countryside between 1968 and 1985. They were sons and daughters, lovers and dreamers, people with futures that were violently stolen from them. They deserve justice, and they deserve to be remembered as more than just victims of a monster. The monster of Florence may never be caught, but these 16 lives will never be forgotten. And somewhere in Italy, the truth still waits to be discovered.